Dude, you broke one of your Easter rules this last year.
I know.
What's up with that?
Well, I tell you what, Dave, I'd do it again. Don't regret it.
No regrets. Hashtag no regrets. Okay. All right. Well, we'll talk about the rule and why you would break it all over again. Hey, welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. We're so glad you're here. Luke, how you doing, man?
I'm great, Dave, man. It's good to be with you.
It's good to be with you, too. Preaching Through podcast. It is so good to have you here listening today. My name's Dave. This is my co-host, Luke Simmons. Every episode, we get together to talk about what it is to preach Jesus in 21st century America. This is season 2. This is our episode all about preaching the sermon series after Easter. Now, in season 1, we've got an episode talking about preaching on Easter Sunday or Christmas Eve, these big events. We talk about Mother's Day in there. We talk about what, preaching through a large event in your church could look like and what maybe you should consider. This one we're talking about immediately after Easter. And what makes it different and unique from Christmas is Christmas Eve, everyone shows up at the same time. I've heard it said like this. It's not actually all these new people coming on Christmas Eve or Easter. It's everybody coming who normally comes at the same time, plus a few additional people.
Yeah, that's probably right.
So Christmas Eve, we immediately take off the next couple of weeks in terms of everybody's just in a food coma.
Well, hopefully the church isn't taking off.
Well,
right?
not taking off.
I know some churches that do, right? That last Sunday of the year, they might break to allow a break for volunteers. But even that right there is the only reason they do that is because people are already taking a break.
Right. We talked about this in another episode.
Yeah.
But just the annual calendar has a natural flow, and so we're just lining up with that. Well, Easter, there is no natural break, natural relaxation, natural vacation time immediately following. So that means really there's a huge opportunity to get maybe some people who had a great Easter experience who are convinced, I should return. This is the opportunity to cash in.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to talk about this, and we're going to get into this rule that you broke because I've had this rule, and we've even talked about this in the past, and you said, but I'm actually not going to do that this year, so we'll talk about it.
Your first 200 sermons are going to be terrible. This is something the late Tim Keller once said, meaning that no matter how hard you study, how many hours you put in, or how much you work on your preaching, there's this glass ceiling that can only be broken with more reps. So, getting reps becomes your main way of growing as a preacher. But what happens when you surpass 200 sermons? What are you supposed to work on? Where should you try and grow, or what muscles are you going to need to build to have a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry over the long haul? Well, the Preaching Lab is a curriculum developed by our co-host, Luke Simmons, that fills this gap and takes preachers beyond what they've learned in seminary or Bible college. This live experience provides preachers with meaningful feedback, insight, and instruction so that they can improve their preaching for a faithful and fruitful preaching ministry. During this 12-week preaching cohort, preachers learn of minor adjustments to their sermon habits that have a major impact on the preaching moment. Tweaks that nobody in your congregation has the ability or the confidence to give you. It's a deep inspection of your routines, habits, study, and preaching, all so that you can become a better steward of the gift God has given you every single week, an audience. This is your opportunity to return the favor back to your congregation and preach a sermon that is faithful and fruitful. Visit faithfulandfruitful.com/lab to learn more about the Preaching Lab live cohort, as well as the Preaching Lab on-demand video curriculum. Now back to the podcast.
We've had this huge buildup towards Easter, a lot of momentum that's created, and then all of a sudden we get done with that. And the natural thing is to kind of feel like a taper off. Okay, we did it. We crossed the finish line. But truthfully, Easter Sunday is just the beginning of the race because now you've got this momentum and you want to capitalize on it. So
and that's especially true when Easter's earlier.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that makes Easter weird is how it moves around every year.
Yeah.
Like Christmas Eve is pretty predictably on December 24th, like the day changes. But yeah, Easter really messes with you. So Like in 2024, Easter's March 31st, right? That's about as early as it gets.
Yeah.
And that gives you a pretty big chunk. I mean, that's a full month before May, right? Around here, at least. May in Arizona, May is crazy, right? It's all every end of the year recital, every end of the year, everything with school is tough. You get into Mother's Day. But I think if you can have a good chunk of time between Easter and Mother's Day, there is actually an opportunity to really build momentum after Easter.
We're going to talk about what are the things that we really want to incorporate into this sermon series, into our individual sermons, as well as things that we should be considering as the lead pastor, as the preacher of those. And so we want to start by assuming that this is a good opportunity to introduce ourselves, i.e. the church, i.e. the pastor, to potentially new people who have come.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is a great opportunity is on Easter Sunday, if there's a window there to share your own testimony, to share about how you met the Lord, to share about why the risen Christ is meaningful to you. If you don't do that on Easter Sunday, which is fine, that's not a rule to me. But it would be a great thing to do in the series at some point after Easter, right? If you're imagining, okay, we've got an influx of some people who are new and they came once on Easter. Maybe they're going to come back at some point during that series. Well, figuring out how to introduce yourself to them. And one of the coolest ways to do that is to share your testimony, to share your story, to share a little bit of just the heart of the church. Sometimes the story, if it's relevant, of how the church started and why we do what we do, and that sort of a thing can be helpful. Not necessarily to make the series all about you or all about your church, but to be able to introduce folks to go, oh, okay, I know what this place is about.
Giving them a little bit of a context for here is why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. And truthfully, it's a good opportunity to refresh people who have called this home church, who have called this, hey, yeah, I go to Gateway every single week. I've been going there for 6 years. There's this idea for us that we remember what we say far more than the people
Sure.
who, I think you've put it like this, like every week they come with their little communion cup, and when they leave, they spill half of it on the way to the car. And
yeah, so to speak. I mean, it is the kind of thing as a leader. I mean, any leader knows that by the time you're getting tired of it, they're just starting to understand it. And so figuring out one of the biggest challenges of leadership is how to keep saying the same things creatively. And so making this a discipline in these follow-up series, whether it's follow-up from Easter or kicking off the new year or back to school, all of those are great opportunities for you to drip throughout the sermons, little flavors of who we are as a church, who I am as a leader, what we're on this planet to do, why we exist. All that is really significant.
It would be very easy to phone that stuff in the sense of just repeat what you've always said. But I would say do the work to do that effectively.
Sure.
Put in the effort to explain it in a new, engaging, enticing way. Think about the context of the church now versus how it started and what God has done, and infuse that into the way that you're talking about it. And in a way that if you explained this 5 years ago, you never would have been able to explain it this same way. Do the actual work to make it a compelling vision, a compelling story, and not just a repeat of what you've said 10 times before.
Yeah. And again, you can overdo this, and I don't at all want to be creating personality-driven churches.
Sure.
On the other hand, there's a reality when people invite people, a lot of times they're inviting because they believe in the preaching. I'll ask people in our newcomer classes, I'll say, hey, when you came the first time, why did you come? That's always a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And then when you came the second time, why'd you come back? And a good number of those people will say, I really enjoyed the sermon. And maybe they're just telling me that because, that's who they're talking to. But that's how it is, right? And so, I remember a church that I went to where, when I would invite someone, I'd say, oh, man, you'd love this pastor. He's a real guy. He only started becoming Christian in his 30s. Before that, he was in commercial real estate. He just seems like a normal guy. You're going to be able to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, people think about those things. And so the way they know you, the way that they frame kind of here's what matters to this person, that actually is important, not just for the people that are coming back after Easter, but for the culture you're developing in the church.
Now we're going to talk about the rule that you broke when it comes to Easter. I'll let you do the talking here.
Yeah. So one of my rules here is that the lead pastor, senior pastor who preaches on Easter ought to also preach the next week. And I think even probably most of the next series, depending on how long that series goes. I just think you don't want to give people whiplash. You don't want people to come on one day and go like, holy cow, it was exciting and good this first day. And this second day, what happened, And so, generally I would say like, hey, as the lead pastor, do that. Now, I broke that rule this year. I have a daughter that's playing club volleyball, and she had a tournament in Salt Lake City. And I have a companion pass on Southwest. So it was like, well, we can buy one ticket and she can be my companion, or we'll have to buy 2 tickets. And I thought, you know what? I want to be with my daughter. And so I do think there are good family reasons. Obviously, if there's health reasons and stuff like that, that's something. But I really think that a pastor should not be so worn out from Easter that he has to take the next week off. Better to steward your energy well leading up to Easter. And this is where people can go back and listen to that preaching through Christmas Eve and Easter episode, how to steward your energy, how to take care of yourself during that process so that you can actually capitalize on the momentum that comes after Easter. So yeah, that was the rule. That's the rule I have, and that's the rule we broke.
It's important to note that one of the reasons that you could break that is because you don't preach 52 times a year.
Yeah, that's right. We have a good preaching team, and the other folks that preach there are, they're strong, they're good. And in this particular case, right, I didn't preach the Sunday after Easter, but the guy who was hosting, he was the service host who people saw up front. He was also then the one preaching the next week. So again, it didn't create this whiplash. Who is this person, a guest speaker or something like that on a second Sunday? And really, this gets into another rule with Easter and the series after, is you're trying to create consistent experiences.
Yeah.
One of the things that I actually grieve at this stage of our church, and I realize no one will feel sorry for me because it's a problem because the church is large, right?
Mm-hmm.
People want large churches. But what I liked when the church was smaller is we could make Easter almost exactly like a normal Sunday. Normal service times, normal service length. It just would be filled with Easter stuff.
Yeah.
Easter songs and an Easter message, and there'd be flowers, and there might be a photo booth, and there'd be some other stuff that would like make Easter feel special, but really the service felt the exact same. As we got larger, we started having to go, okay, now we've got to do 3 services. Now we've got to do 4 services. Now we've got to do, I think we've done as many as 6. And or it's like, we can't fit all, we don't want to do 6. Let's do 2 of them, but they have to be outside. And, and it's weird times. And instead of being an hour and 15 minutes, it's an hour. And instead of kids ministry going up to 5th grade, it only goes up to 2nd grade. I mean, we've had to start doing all those adjustments. And I don't like that because of this principle, because of this rule. I think if Easter can feel as much like a normal Sunday as possible, that's great on Easter. And I think the series after Easter should feel as much as possible like that. Now, again, I just had to accept, hey, this just is different. Like I used to actually try to start a series on Easter. Maybe we can talk about that and why I would do that. But I don't do that as much now because Easter just does feel more like a special event. I've got 15 minutes to do a sermon versus 35. So I'm going to just make it a little bit different. But yeah, consistency for those folks who are coming back. I mean, this is the thing as it relates to why churches grow and why people invite people, is a consistent experience. You want someone every week to be able to say, hey, I invited this person and I can trust they're going to have a good experience. Otherwise, if it's like they're only going to have a good experience on Friend Sunday, or they're only going to have a good experience on Easter, or they're only going to have, they're not going to invite people. It needs to be consistently strong over time for people to be consistently able to invite friends.
What is it? It's like simplicity well done trumps complex mediocrity or something like that.
That sounds good. I don't know if I said that or you heard that somewhere, but yeah, that seems right.
Yeah. So just be the best version of your normal self and provide an experience that people can trust. If I invite my friend to this, they'll have an experience very similar to this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the rules of Easter. Now, you mentioned the sermon of Easter, maybe even being the lead sermon in a sermon series. You said why we don't do that as much now as we have in the past. But ultimately, it is an option. You could start a brand new series on Easter, especially if that series is oriented around Jesus. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is to delight people. How would you take that into consideration? Like, how do I get these people to come back for this series?
Yeah, it depends what kind of series you're going to try to do. And it depends how you do that, right? If you're a through books of the Bible sequentially sort of person, well, that's one thing. If you're more topical or thematic, that's a different thing. And so I can imagine a lot of sermon series that do involve Jesus, that are centered around the core of the gospel or the implications of the gospel, that would make sense to have the first message of the series be on Easter. Other ones, not so much. Hey, we're gonna do the Psalms. Well, yeah, I don't know. Like, unless there's one about the resurrection that starts it, like, or here comes Leviticus. Like, well, okay. Like maybe start that the week after.
Is that the series title? Here comes Leviticus. Who's Leviticus and why is he coming after me?
Yeah. So here's the reason why, if you can start a sermon series on Easter and it makes sense, it's valuable because you can say, hey, this is part 1. I want to invite you back for part 2. And for people who might go, I kind of want to find out what that rest of that was going to be about. That can be really valuable. Now, maybe you don't do that, but what you do instead is promote your series. Hey, I know that everybody made it out this week, and I'm so glad you did. I want to personally invite you back to join us next week where we're going to talk about this and give a little bit of a preview. So you can do that one way or the other. Either way, hopefully you're promoting whatever's coming next at your Easter service, but they're already in the game, right? And it's like when you're watching the first episode on Netflix and that next episode thing comes right there, like you're more likely to hang in there and do it because you're already in. And so if you can start the series, maybe people are already in and they keep coming back.
That was basically me with 24. Back on DVD.
Oh, yeah.
Spending like $60 to get the 8-disc set. Just be like,
you're dating yourself there, Dave.
Well, you know what? I was like,
there's probably some young bucks listening who have not ever seen 24.
It's good, man.
It's great. It was like the first edge of your seat, like cliffhanger every episode thing that I remember. And yeah, those were good times.
Bloop, 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 man, just that, the sound of the Cisco going on in CTU headquarters.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to hear us talk about this. A couple of the series that we've done, if I'm looking at it and it's accurate here, after Easter one year, Rebuilding, a study of Nehemiah, looks like.
That was I think we did that in the summer.
Okay. So maybe
that was
that
2020.
2021.
Oh, okay.
So maybe we didn't do that immediately after. On the website, it's immediately after.
Here,
Colossians. Oh, do you got it? You got your sermon calendar?
I do.
All right. He's going to bring up the sermon calendar, which gives me an awesome opportunity to say, go back to season 1 and listen to the episode Preaching Through a Sermon Calendar. Being able to have a high level of intention with Christmas, with Easter, with the series after Easter, with your fall launch series, it's only possible if you plan things out, if you can bring other people into the process with you. You don't need to plan this entire calendar all on its own, all on your own. It's really, really great opportunity. Plan it out 6 months, maybe if you've never done one, 12 months if you've already done a 6-month, get it 12 months planned out and you can do this sort of stuff. Did you find it?
Yeah, I found it for the last few years. So
Okay.
This year, right after Easter, and again, we're in a multi-congregational situation, kind of a network type dynamic where different churches, are different sizes and different things. So for us, Easter for all our congregations is a standalone sermon.
Mm-hmm.
So this past year, we started Romans 8 right after that. The year before, we did Colossians. The year before that, we were in the Gospel of John. And so we just kept going where we were. In the
That's
Gospel of
why
John.
on the website it doesn't show. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we kept doing that. I mean, Easter in 2020 after COVID, that was super weird. Everybody was just trying to figure stuff out. Some years ago, we did a series called, this was one when we were smaller, and it was like, hey, we could start the series on Easter. We called it, Who Is This? And we looked at these various encounters of Jesus where people in the Gospels are going, who is this? No one speaks like this person.
Yeah.
That was a good thing to start. This next year, we're going to start the Beatitudes, that first part of Matthew 5. And that's what's going to be, I don't know if we'll call it the blessed life or, something like that. But you could start that on Easter, or you could say, hey, join us next week. You're here because you want God to be blessing your life. We're going to talk about what a blessed life is. So it's thinking intentionally about that one way or the other.
Tangent real quick. How do you think about naming your series? Are you just looking at what other people have done? Do you like just sticking with the Bible names? Like what goes into that process?
Yeah, I think I don't care a lot that much, honestly. Like we've done times where like we preach Galatians and we called it Fighting for Grace, a study of Galatians. There's other times you could preach Galatians, just call it Galatians, I do think in some of those things, a lot depends on who you're trying to reach and whether you think that matters, right? Like, as someone who's going to come to church who doesn't have a church background, are they more or less likely to do it if you call it Fighting for Grace or if you call it Galatians? Well, they're probably not likely to be motivated by either one that much. But series titles, I think part of what they can do is give people a hook on here's what we're doing. The other thing that I've seen more churches do, I haven't done this, but I'm intrigued by it. I was looking recently at a church here in Scottsdale, Arizona, and what they were doing is preaching through 1 Corinthians, but the way they did it was every few chapters they branded as its own series, because Paul is talking about these themes in chapters 1 and 2 and these themes. And, if you looked at their website, it almost would look like they had done 6 or 7 topical series. They were all just expositional series through 1 Corinthians. And so I thought, oh, that's kind of a neat way to do it. So we had in our network, we had some people who were really, they cared a lot that we just called it by the name of the book. And I didn't care that much. So I said, okay, let's just do that.
You've got your thoughts on what series we're going to run, what we're going to talk about, when we're going to start it. You get all of this excitement and planning. What about when the series just doesn't go the way that you want? When it doesn't land the way that you had anticipated? Maybe you feel like you didn't capitalize on the momentum you wanted to do, but it's a reality for lots of series. It just kind of didn't do what you had hoped. How do you deal with that type of disappointment or frustration?
Yeah, it is frustrating anytime you imagine, hey, this is a strategic move that's going to accomplish this, and it doesn't really seem to pan out that way. That's frustrating. And a lot of ministry, I've just learned over time, is handling disappointment and handling losses and handling limits. One thing I would want to do is try to do a little bit of a debrief on it. Some people would call this an autopsy, which I guess fits if it feels like, well, that sermon series really died. But to go, okay, what happened? Was there some place we dropped the ball leading up to Easter? Was there something about the way we framed the series, the way we talked about it, or the way we promoted it? Or, was there anything we could have done different? Or, was this actually like, Easter was kind of late this year and it bumped into all the stuff with May, and or it just, so this is also, and man, I feel like almost every episode we come back to these ABCs, these assumptions, beliefs, convictions about preaching. One of my assumptions and beliefs and convictions about preaching is that most life change just happens in a moment. And those moments are pretty rare for most people. Like, most people don't have a life-changing experience more than at most a couple times a year. And so this might just be a series where, that didn't really hit for a lot of people. But I also think that it's the repetitive consistency, faithfulness over time that eventually tills the soil that God's going to use to bring a more, transforming moment down the road. And so it's disappointing, especially if we're getting obsessed with our church growing. But I also think to be faithful, to be consistent, to learn what we can and try to make adjustments for the future, that's the only hope you have really for trying to make it different.
Do you have any strong feedback loops that you listen to help you gauge whether or not the series is landing the way that you want? How do you come to that conclusion that it was a dud, other than just the I've heard people say, or, I really feel like?
This is what's hard. It's like the series might be fine, but there might be other reasons why the church isn't growing. On one hand, if sermons consistently stink, the church is probably not growing. But like, I think we can maybe overly connect a sermon series and the growth of the church. For example, one of my mentors in ministry, Larry Osborne, he has this great thing he did with me on how to grow a word of mouth church. In all the years of North Coast is this huge church in San Diego, and they've never done any, official marketing or whatever. I mean, they do social media stuff now, but like, it's all grown through word of mouth. And what he says is, in any word of mouth thing, and this, Dave, I'm sure this is true for you in the marketing agency. Mm-hmm. This is true in any service industry. This is true at restaurants. There's a product and a process. The product, it's the food. The process is how easy it is to get a table, how the server treats you. Did they get it right? The product is your insurance. The process is how easy is it to get a quote, et cetera. Mm-hmm. For church, it's the product is the service, the sermon, right? But the process is how easy is it to check your kids in, and how easy is it to find a parking spot, and how easy is it to navigate the website. And here's what he says. This is what's so interesting. If people love the product, but they're inconvenienced by the process, they will keep coming. They just won't invite friends. They'll say, you know what? I can handle the lousy kids check-in thing, but I'm not going to invite friends who are going to get in, right, where I'm going to be embarrassed once their kids go through, and so I think when a church isn't growing, let's look at the sermon series, but let's look at the other stuff too. And a lot of times there are these breakdowns in different processes that are making it where people are less likely to invite friends.
I think that's a good point. If the preaching just absolutely stinks, then you need to focus in on that. Like
Sure.
you can't just continually put out bad food and be like, well, y'all need to eat up, right? Like you need to make what you're serving up better. That's one of the big problems that I have when folks are making comments on social media, just preach the word. I'm like, well, you could preach the word, but it could be incredibly boring and
Sure.
it can be incredibly uninspiring. And I don't know, there's no scripture that says this, but in my mind, it's like you could really make people fall out of love with scripture if you just make it boring and terrible and don't really think about the experience and truthfully, don't steward the word and give it the electricity that really is in there, right? Like you could do a really poor version of an amazing book, a really poor movie version. And that's why everybody goes, the book was so much better, right? Because it was the same content, but it was just served up in a poor way. And so if we're thinking about, well, how are we going to grow the church? And our sermon series, it didn't work. Well, are you examining, first and foremost, make sure you get the preaching right, but then examine all of the other areas and say, are we doing things to reinforce and to elevate and to make things easy and to make it so when people come, they're not tired and they're not sweaty and they're not just like there was one church where out here in Arizona, check-in was out in the sun. And it's like in July, you're checking your kids in and it's just beaming on you. It takes you 15,
and it's probably melting their stickers that they're supposed to put on their kids' backs.
And it takes 20 minutes to cool down inside the service.
Well, and in the preaching, I do think there is something that should be evaluated. Like if you go, hey, we made a big push and our processes are pretty good, and I was really hoping this would build momentum and it didn't. Maybe one thing to look at is, am I preaching in such a way that makes people think, oh, I wish I had invited my friend to hear this. Right? Because the more often that they're having that experience where they go, oh, darn it, I should have invited Sheila to come to blah, blah, blah. Well, the more likely they are to somewhere down the road invite Sheila, right? So it's talking about things in a way that again, not trying to cater to them, but trying to minister to them, trying to speak in such a way that people think, you know what, my non-Christian friends would understand this. I went, Dave, to this amazing church. I'm so grateful for this church. It gave me so much vocabulary and understanding theologically. This was a church I went to in college, and the preacher was just an incredible expositor of scripture. And he was, I found it as a believer so interesting, but I never, ever once invited one of my baseball teammates. Never. Because I just knew they wouldn't get this. Now, again, I praise God for that preacher and for that church. And I think you could argue that church's particular calling was to really raise up Christians and send them out and check. I mean, that's happened for me. Like I'm now blessing more, college baseball player types. Yeah. But man, people just knew like, my friends wouldn't get this. Find someone in your church who didn't grow up in church. Find someone who's more of a blue collar-ish type person. Find someone who, again, Larry Osborne, he calls them a hell of a talk guys, right? These are the people who hear your sermon and they go, Pastor, that was a hell of a talk. Like find a guy like that and ask them, hey, what would have to change in my preaching for you to want to invite some of your friends? Those might be some things to look at if you feel like you're doing all the other pieces right and people still aren't inviting folks.
So what this makes me think of is if you go to faithfulandfruitful.com, on that website, there is something we have called the Preacher's Resource Pack. And there's 3 resources in there that are excellent in helping you contextualize your sermon. And we're not talking about over-contextualizing where we become like the world. We're not talking about being completely irrelevant in our context where it's just like, this doesn't make any sense. But it's just saying the fact that we are here and now, there is a context and we want to make sure to be aware of that. The second piece is the stronger language with transitional verbs and key nouns. And this is so you say things like, instead of saying like, here are 3 things that are true about Scripture, it's saying like, here are 3 deficiencies that Scripture defines in a Christ-filled life.
Yeah.
And it immediately is like, well, I want to hear more about that. And then the third thing, and this is what I've been building up to, is there is a sermon evaluation form. Not only is this sermon evaluation form great for you to look at and just say, okay, where am I checking the box? Where might be I be falling short? But you could approach some of those hell of a talk guys. And if you've got that type of a relationship, it's like, hey, maybe give me a little bit of feedback here. But just some feedback is better than no feedback at all, especially if you're asking the correct way. And this sermon evaluation form, maybe you don't give them the whole thing. Maybe you pick a couple questions and you say, hey, what do you think about this? But that'll at least get you going in the right direction.
And one of the questions on that form is, would you have wanted to invite a non-Christian to hear this?
Yeah.
Right? Scale of 1 to 5. How much would you have wanted that? So that's a lot of what it is people are going to come when they feel like, oh, my friends would get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is just some big tent ideas, some big tent conversation over what you should preach on in that sermon series after Easter. None of this is, hey, you've got to do it this way. Heck, we even broke one of our own rules, right?
Sure.
Like there's a time and a place for everything. The undercurrent to all of this is, I think, just intentionality. You can't go wrong with having conversations with the leaders in your church, with saying, okay, we have to do a sermon series after Easter. What might be a better option, a more preferred option than just whatever comes to me the week of? And I mean, the sermon's not going to be great if you're just planning it the week of. But if we want to be intentional, if we want to capitalize it, just get out there and start planning. I think that's really what ultimately gives you the freedom to make that sermon series really stellar.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening to this episode of the Preaching Through podcast. We're so grateful that you spent just a little bit of time with us. There's a lot of podcasts out there. There's a lot of different preaching resources. And if we can be just one voice of encouragement, really that's what we're aiming for. So if we did that, if we hit the mark, praise God, we're so glad to hear that. We would love to hear from you. If you've got questions, follow-ups, or if there's something you'd love to hear more about, you can message us info@faithfulandfruitful.com. That would be a real treat for us to hear from you, but even a bigger treat to be able to serve you and just get to know you and resource you. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please take a moment to review the podcast. That type of feedback loop would be really, really helpful for us as well. We have a few more episodes left in this season. If you haven't listened to the episodes we've already released, please go back and take a look. I believe you'll find something in there that can minister to you, Pastor, at the season of ministry where you are at. And again, be a voice of encouragement. Luke, anything else you want to say before we're all done?
Dave, thanks for your work on this, man. You do a great job keeping us on track, and I really appreciate it.
In the radio industry, they call it a driver. So I'll just keep driving, my man.
Yeah, baby.
All right, thanks. See you guys.